Leviticus, because that's very helpful just to center us in Leviticus, and also a general Old Testament timeline, especially as we talk about different dates, so that we know where we're at, what's going on. So as always, I just like to remind us of why are we studying Leviticus? And as always, we have this connection to our Old Testament ancestors. It's going to give us deeper insights to the New Testament context, and it gives us a better understanding of Jewish culture. And today, what I really hope we're going to get out of this is just a really different way for us to look at understanding ethics. Some notes about this journey. Again, as always, this is sometimes really difficult because we're studying an ancient text. And my encouragement to you all is to let the book speak for itself. We're going to really have to practice this skill today because we're going to be talking about some really weird things and some really different ways of understanding how to order your life and what to do with it. And so what I've always encouraged people is just let the book speak. Don't bring ourselves to it. Don't bring our judgments to it. Let it just say to us what it's going to say, and then we can dig deeper into it and what we think about that. Okay, so a review from the last couple of weeks. We talked about the first week that Moses did not write the Torah. There was actually many authors who were sources of information for the Torah. Leviticus is written mostly by a priestly source, and today we're going to talk about the other source as well. It was during the priestly source, it was written mostly during the exile or as the nation was returning from their exile. And there's two parts, the priestly source and the holiness code. We're going to talk a little bit more about the holiness code today and the background on that. Now last week, we talked about the sacrificial system. That's in chapters 1 through 7 of Leviticus, and that contains 5 offerings. And that's a really good foundation for us today because those pop up a little bit in what we're going to talk about. And we also talked about the Day of Atonement, which cleanses the nation of Israel. We talked about the sacrifice metaphor for salvation. This is coming out of the New Testament now. When we approach the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, or just, I should maybe say, the death of Christ on the cross, we have many ways to understand that. I kind of shared my opinion that Christ's death and resurrection, meaning our forgiveness of sins and eternal life, is something that on a cosmological level, I don't think we can understand. So we use metaphors to get at bits of this truth because it is such a complex and deep truth. Now one metaphor, is the sacrifice metaphor, which comes directly out of the context of Leviticus. And I really talked about the book of Hebrews in relation to that. That Hebrews is this, we kind of call it sermon, that is trying to explain how Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice and how that means our forgiveness of sins. I offered out and encouraged people to read Hebrews a little bit more deeply this week, just to kind of get that context. I'm curious if anyone was able to do that, and if you had any insights you wanted to share.
I read it, and I thought the comparison between what the priests do in Leviticus with the blood, that the blood of Christ shed for us. So that's the connection I got from Hebrews.
Right. Connection of, because in Leviticus it's sprinkling the blood on the altar,
right.
And of course it's the blood of Christ on the cross, and we see that.
We don't need that kind of sacrifice.
Yeah. It's really amazing if you get to dig into Hebrews, just the depth they go to explain these connections and how it all works, and just how truly ultimate Christ is, meaning there is no more sacrifice, it is done. Or as Christ said, it was finished. It's amazing. So let's then move into, I'm going to briefly go over the Holiness Code and just kind of give a little background on that like I've done with the priestly source. So the Holiness Code is chapter 17 through 23 for sure of Leviticus. Some scholars will throw on 24 to 27. I think that they're a bit of a combination of the Holiness Code and priestly source, but we'll talk about that a bit more next week. I'm going to just focus on 17 through 22 today. Holiness Code is likely the older source of the two. It's really hard to date it. There's not a lot of great consensus around this. There's more consensus, at least, that it's older. A lot of the work I've done with certain scholars, they try to date it to about the 8th century. So if we're going back to our timeline, or going to the 8th century, that's when there's starting to be unrest, at least in the northern kingdom of Israel. So there's starting to be issues there. And if that's the case, it explains some of the things the Holiness Code is thinking about and concerned about. Like I said a lot with the priestly code, we have to remember they're talking to us out of a crisis. They're talking to us out of a situation that has a pastoral need. And that's what's kind of driving why we're writing this right now and how we're writing it. Same thing's true with the Holiness Code. But just because we have less sense of exactly where it came from and when, we have a little less sense of what it would be responding to. The reason we call it the Holiness Code, and the reason why we know it's distinct, is really this phrase that comes up a lot, ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And that ye there, it's Old English, I mean that's like the King James Version, but the ye is important. It's communal. It's like the Southern y'all. We're not saying you shall be holy, you all shall be holy. We're referring to the whole nation. And that's going to come up a lot in the theology of the Holiness Code. And so it's concerned with the holiness of the nation. The priestly source, not surprisingly, written by a priest. I will argue there's a bit more to it than that. But they have a really lot of focus on the priests. Holiness Code's thinking a little bit differently than that. So now, what I'm going to do for us today, just to kind of help us talk about these two really different things, the purity laws and the Holiness Code, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context that they're thinking of. Both of these sources are talking about the ethics of that time. How do we live the right way? But they have a very different way of approaching it than you and I would. So we really kind of have to delve into what they're thinking about and why. The first thing they're thinking about, and this is true for both the Holiness Code and the purity laws, is they're thinking about the fact that Israel is the set-apart nation. So if you kind of think of it like this diagram, this is all of humanity out in the corner here. Out there, the furthest circle. We're going to get next into Israel. Israel is kind of this next holy nation. It's getting a little bit closer to holiness here, right in the middle. Now, this is the priestly source's view of it. Priestly source is going to say, like, yes, Israel is holy. They are called by God. They were given the land, all these things. But the priests have another level of holiness. You know, they're this much closer. We talked about that last week with the Day of Atonement, that the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies only. But we also talked about the fact that in the priestly source, you have the laity who are involved in sacrifices. They come to the area of the temple, they're outside, but they're the ones who are participating in sacrifice as well. So it's acknowledging that there is another level tier to the laity, but the priests are going to be a little closer. Now the Holiness Code actually would hold pretty similarly to this. Holiness Code just kind of blur this line a little bit more between Israel and the priests. And they would really hold to that the nation of Israel is holy. And the priests are important, and yes, they're holy. But just kind of hold them a little more equal with each other. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. Our ethics are based around that Israel is a set-apart, holy nation. So we are looking a little bit of how do we live in such a way that we are set apart, that we are the ones called by God. Now, there's going to be a couple ways that they're going to do this. First off, we're going to have a spectrum called pure and defiled. So that sounds really horrible, because we're talking about you're going to be either pure or defiled. And whenever I was getting ready for this day, I knew this day was coming, I kept thinking about the words I was going to have to use. And I was just like, wouldn't that just be the worst insult ever? If someone came up to you and said, you are so defiled? Like, that would just be terrible. The good news for us is the words I'm using have very different meanings than what we're bringing to them. So don't try to bring what you think these words mean. Just hold off and let me delve into them just a little bit more so we know what's going on here. Because first thing I want to point out about this pure and defiled spectrum, it's not about sinfulness inherently. Because if we hear someone's defiled and we're thinking Old Testament context, that would be our first thought, right? This person is sinful, something's wrong. That's not the case with this spectrum. In this spectrum, this is just life. All of your life, you are somewhere between pure and defiled. We're going to talk a little bit more in the purity codes. This is where a lot of this is going to come out of, is Leviticus 11 through 15. You can become defiled by very normal things. Things that you have no control over. But the thing is there's ways to go back to purity. So it's not about like you're locked into the sinfulness and you can never go back to being pure. I'm going to read a scripture too from Leviticus 15:32 just to kind of help give us a sense of this spectrum. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, so that they do not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. So yeah, and there's a couple other words I just want to throw out there for what defiled could also mean, and again, don't bring our context to it, is that defiled could be impure or unclean, especially I think in the NRSV you're going to see clean and unclean quite a lot. And again, this is all about moving between purity and defilement, but it's just that this is natural. This is the way of life. So that's the horizontal spectrum we're going to look at. We're going to look at the vertical spectrum then as well, holy and profane. Again, profane just sounds awful, doesn't it? It's not about sinfulness. Profane is not really negative in this sense. Profane is kind of a neutral word here. Profane just really means anything that's not holy. And that kind of makes sense, right? You either have to be holy or you're just not holy in a sense. Now the interesting thing is that holiness can come directly from God or divinely prescribed actions, like a sacrificial system. So, holiness here, at least in the Israelite understanding, is not something that's like only for God. There's a way for us to be holy, and this is really important if we're talking about a nation that wants to be a holy nation. Just to also kind of read another scripture from Leviticus that demonstrates this. This is coming out of Leviticus 22, 31 through 33, which would be the holiness code. Thus you shall keep my commandments and observe them. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord, I sanctify you. I who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. Okay. So let's put this all together. This is truly a way we can think about it, that we have this whole system together, that you're moving between pure and defilement, holiness and profanity. And you truly can be in any one of these quadrants. You can be defiled at the same time being holy, because they're kind of two different spectrums, but they're working together. And this is what's creating the ethic behind Israel. And we know we have these two sources, and we have to work together. And I will argue that they do. Some scholars will say these are kind of just two separate things, they don't make sense together. I think there's some unity, though we have to recognize they are different authors, different theologies, but they knew, I would say that the priestly source knew the holiness code and was aware of it. So when that person was writing, they were keeping this in mind. So for example, I just want to give some scriptures from the other ones that kind of talk about each other. So if we look at Leviticus 11:44, which would be priestly, it says, "For I am the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy." So there seems like some influence of holiness code in the purity codes. And if we also go to the holiness code, they will talk about the priests, and they will talk about sacrifices too. The holiness code isn't saying like priests aren't important, we don't need sacrifices. It's just looking at it in a little different way. So, and one of the scholars I've worked with a lot, Jacob Milgram, has described it as that the holiness code and priestly source regard the end result of disobeying God as the same way. That essentially it's going to lead to the abandonment of Israel. He argues that the priestly source thinks that if we don't listen to God, like we're going to be taken over by other people, like they were, so speaking out of that experience they already had. The holiness code has a different perspective though. As he puts it, the holiness code presumes a natural ecological cause and effect. Israel pollutes the land becomes infertile, Israel is forced to leave. So same end result, just different ways they would get there. So now we have to keep that in mind, that this is how the people are approaching. We're going to worship God, we're going to live our lives, we're going to be the holy set-apart nation, we're going to live within this context. So the purity laws, how are they going to go about doing this? I'm just going to kind of go through the few chapters that these are and what their main theme is about. So chapter 11, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as like the dietary laws or dietary codes. These are the clean and unclean animals, and a lot of us, if we're familiar with Jewish people who follow kosher, a lot of this is going to come out of here. Chapter 12 deals with purity after childbirth. Chapter 13 and 14 are very similar. They're talking about leprous diseases, which, interestingly, we know leprosy as a certain disease, and I think nowadays we call it Hansen's disease. The way Leviticus describes it, it's totally not that. It's some other many skin diseases. The main thing that they seem to have in common is like it's kind of a scaly, like you can see it. So it's interesting when scholars look at this today, they're like, there's lots of other diseases that should meet the criteria that they're talking about in Leviticus, but it's really like, it seems to be that if you can see something on a person, that's the skin diseases they are looking at. And then chapter 15 talks about bodily discharges. And this is a really good example of what I was saying about how you can become defiled by something that's just pure and natural. These are talking about things for both men and women that just happen. And you can then have to wash yourself, but you move back from defilement to purity. It's just part of life, and you can't control it. Yes, Liz?
Kjirstin, do we know any more about why certain animals were clean and unclean? Is that a mystery, or do scholars have a sense of, why this animal and not another animal?
So Liz is asking the question of why are some animals and not other animals? And this is where we're working out of, we have the answers to questions that we don't know what the questions were. So no, it is confusing to scholars, particularly because Leviticus talks about certain animals and Deuteronomy talks about different animals. So we don't quite know. There's one theory that's like the cleanliness theory, that pork, because we know pigs were considered unclean, is harder to cook in the sense that it's harder to safely cook it. So if they didn't eat pork, it was just like, it's because we know it can make you sick and die, we're not going to eat it. But I've heard other scholars who really dig into the theology of this, and they say, you know what, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, yes, it wasn't as safe, but it wasn't to the point that you just couldn't eat it. So that's maybe not it. So no, we don't, we're kind of guessing. So one other scholar, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, about why he said, like why he thinks there was something to this. It's actually really cool, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. So why is it that the purity laws are set apart? How are they working back into that paradigm I showed you earlier? So here we go, the example of the clean and unclean animals. So I'm going to show you another. So this is what we saw earlier. This is where we have this example again of the set apart nation, humanity. So this would be any person. This would be anyone who's not a part of the nation of Israel is on the outside. Israel is more holy, called by God. Priests are the next holiness, and then this is God in the middle, basically. So one of the scholars I was working with really drew a comparison between humankind and basically animal kind. So what he was arguing is that you got all the animals out here. And we have to remember, Israel's one nation of many. All the nations around them, who they're saying we're set apart from, we're different from, they're eating all sorts of animals. Those would be the ones like eating pigs and hopefully not dying all the time. So then we get to these these dietary laws that say, okay, there's some animals that are clean, there's some that are not. You can eat the clean ones. But there are a few that you can eat that you can't sacrifice. So he's making this comparison that, so we have some animals like here who are Israel that you can, they are set apart somewhat. But then we have some that are set apart even more. Those are the only ones you can sacrifice to God. There's something more holy about them. So he's just saying that there's a comparison here. And when you think about it ethically, he points out that animals have to be sacrificed in a humane way. We talked about that last week. And when they're talking about the dietary laws, they're holding up again that blood part. You can't have the blood. So he's going back to, all is how we live ethically. And he makes the point that because of these extra laws on the Israelites and how they're going to eat meat, this is playing back into our purity codes in that they have to, it's their prerequisite for ethical life. Only through a daily regimen of disciplines that remind humans that life is sacred can humans aspire to a regimen or to a way of life fully informed by other ethical virtues. The dietary laws are rungs on the ladder of holiness, leading to a life of pure thought and deed, characteristic of the nature of God. So he's arguing that this is them setting themselves apart by holding themselves to a higher standard, a holier standard than those of other nations. So that's one example in the purity laws about how they're set apart. The other example is going to come from Leviticus 12 and Leviticus 15 about menstrual blood. So the reason why this is significant is, and this is really putting ourselves in a different context here. In the ancient world, menstrual blood was seen as evil. I want to read to you some quotes from other ancient sources. This is from the Talmud. If a menstruate woman passes between two men, if it is at the beginning of her menses, she will slay one of them. And if it is at the end of her menses, she will cause strife between them. So that's the Talmud. There was some writings from early Arab writings that says, if a woman sees a snake, she should take some of her hair and fingernails and throw it at them and say, I'm menstruous. Menstrual blood was seen as something very, very evil. That's kind of in that whole ancient worldview. And I talked about this last week. Priestly source is extremely monotheistic. There is one God. Now that makes sense to us, but what we have to remind ourselves is we're working in a context that didn't just talk about gods that are good, it talked about things that are bad. So if priestly source is going to say we are super monotheistic, there is only one God, we can't hold that there are sources of evil in the world. That means menstrual blood can't be evil. So if we read Leviticus 12 and Leviticus 15, which talks about how women must live when they're menstruating, it's actually extremely different. Women were isolated. They were forced out of their homes while they were menstruating because it was considered evil. Leviticus changes that. Leviticus, it's kind of, again, very strange to say that it's everything below the woman, basically. But that means she can be in her home. It's just anything that she would sit on or lay on. So typically women just had like a separate chair and separate bed for that time of the month. But they could be in their homes, they could cook their meals, they could take care of their children, they could go on about daily life. And then at the end, they would wash and they'd be clean again. Moving back from defilement to purity. Still weird to us. And like one of the scholars I read is like, this doesn't exonerate them. This like doesn't make it better in a sense. But we have to recognize that they're setting themselves apart. They're being a different nation than all those other nations around them. So I'm going to move to the Holiness Code next. Before I do that, though, just are there any questions or reasons to pause?
Why were some of the animals not able to be sacrificed? Were they considered defiled, or?
Yeah, again, so the question is, why were some animals not able to be sacrificed? It's again, we're going back to that. We have this answer, and we don't quite know how they got there. I mean, the Bible will give these reasons about the hooves and the chewing cud, but we don't quite know where that's coming from. It could be like they were just taboos in culture, and now they're giving reasons behind it. There could be a theological reason. We don't quite know. What I keep likening this to in my head is like when I was a teacher in Tanzania, I was a math teacher, and I made my students show me their work. Because sometimes they just write down answers. Usually my suspicion was they just used a calculator. I wanted to know they could do the work. Right now I feel like I'm a math teacher who's getting like x is equal to 6, and I'm like, great, how'd you get to that? I just want to know like how did we get there? And we'll never know. That's the hard part, is we just don't have the mentality. And also we have to remember, this is now the written record we're working with. And as we talked about before, there was many years of lived experience and significance built, and we don't quite know what led to it. Some of it could simply be, that's the way we've always done it. We live into that, right? That this is the way our institution's always done it. That's why we still do it. You sometimes come across traditions we don't remember the history of. It could very well be that. Okay. So the Holiness Code. So again, just to kind of go over how the Holiness Code is broken up. Chapter 17 is kind of this bridge between the priestly source and the Holiness Code, and talks about animal sacrifice. Chapter 18 is sexual relations. Chapter 19 is ritual and moral holiness. Chapter 20 again is sexual relations and other impure acts. Chapters 21 and 22 are really talking about priesthood. Particularly 21 is like the holiness of priests, and then 22 is how we use our offerings. I'll leave it up for just a second. What I really want to point out while we're here is, so chapter 19 is considered the heart of the Holiness Code. And it's kind of considered the entire deeper understanding of it. They think originally it probably, like in the Holiness Code itself, was the opening chapter. But interestingly, they put the 2 chapters on sexual relations around it to draw attention to 19. It's a literary term called chiasmus. And then they think 17 was added in to be that bridge, to kind of walk you into the Holiness Code. Chapter 19 would be considered, they said, the middle of Leviticus, and it draws attention to it, because it's like the center. Some scholars kind of say everything originates around chapter 19 of Leviticus. It's really important. So we're going to talk about that a little bit now with this, why is the Holiness Code set apart? So the first case study we're going to do is Leviticus 19. And so, first thing I want to point out is that Leviticus 19 is really concerned about the care of the neighbor and the alien. So I want to read 2 scriptures from Leviticus 19. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. 1934. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So those statements should be very familiar to us, because Jesus said them. If we go back to the Great Commandment, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, that comes out of Deuteronomy. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That comes out right out of Leviticus. So, again, living differently. How are we going to live better? And that really gets us into the next point, that they're living ethically as a response. So this is where it's a little trickier, because we don't know as much about the dating of the Holiness Code. But if we're going with the general assumption that's written in the 8th century, like I said, historically then, the nation of Israel is starting to have issues. They're starting to get taken over by other nations, and Assyria will eventually conquer them. The prophets, Old Testament prophets, are crying out that there's something wrong in the nation. And as many of us have heard this cry, it's that you're doing sacrifices, you're doing these things, but you're not caring for the poor and the oppressed, you're not caring for the widow, you're not doing the right things. So the Holiness Code is seen as a response to that we're going to live differently. We're going to get it right, so to speak. Some of the verses from 19 that speak to this, Our 1935, for example, you shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. So you hear this theme of, we're going to be good to our neighbors again. We're going to actually treat them right. We're not going to take advantage of them. And you see this a few times in 19. If you were not able to read chapter 19 before today, I would really encourage you after today to go read 19 alone. It's a very fascinating chapter of all these things put together about how we're going to live ethically. And you're also going to see individual responsibility coming out here. And this is a theological change that's kind of happening at this time. You know, the Holiness Code is very much concerned with the nation of Israel. That's why we have the Day of Atonement. We cleanse the whole nation. But both the Holiness Code and the priestly source are starting to point at, but individuals can be responsible too. It's not just about the nation. So, for example, I am the Lord your God, Yahweh, appears 16 times in chapter 19, and almost always when you can do something in secret. So, like, you could violate the law of God, and no one else knows. Only you do. So now starting to get to some of that individual responsibility, right? And especially because your individual responsibility affects the whole nation. This was the idea that your sins are going somewhere. Like, again, the land of God will become so polluted, God won't be there anymore. So it's reminding you, it's teaching you, you need to be responsible for your sins. And the last example here is that if you read chapters 18 and 20, they're very bizarre chapters to read. I mean, it's basically a long list of all the people you're not supposed to have sex with. It's kind of like, why in the world do we need to talk about this? Interestingly, in the culture at this time, those chapters were protective of women, because women could be passed around the family as a concubine. By saying all these things very bluntly, you're not going to do this, it protected women. Particularly the example I saw was, if a father dies, his wife could then just be passed directly to his son. That prevented it. So these laws, again, we read them and go, why in the world? But they actually had a protective effect for women. So again, this is the Holiness Code setting itself apart. Okay. So I know that's a lot. And it's a very different way for us to think about how we're going to live our lives. But I do think there's a lot here for us to think about and discuss, because it's getting at a question that we ought to be asking ourselves as Christians. How do we live our lives in a way that reflects the ethics we have? So I'm just curious, hearing this today, first off, what's this experience like for you? And how do you receive things like a purity code and a holiness code?
I think foremost you have to ask, I know I was rereading the portion about the food today because it interests me a lot, is you just can't, I have no clue, it makes no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
The hooves and the cud and even though he's got the split hooves, that pig really still isn't good. I had a teacher when I was younger, a history teacher who was Jewish. And she had guessed that the objection to certain of these animals is because either they have specific work purposes, like the camel, or like a pig, they take too much water to maintain them. And this is a place where water is not necessarily the most abundant commodity. And so you'd be better off focusing on things like goats and sheep that derive most of their water from what they eat.
Yeah.
Just a theory.
No, I could totally accept this theory that these animals were just not beneficial, that pigs took too much work or camels weren't as helpful, so therefore we're just going to put this in a code. I could totally accept that theory, because there are lots of people who posit similar reasons, like again, like the reason like that pork is hard to cook, it will make you sick, let's just not do it, let's not eat it. Yeah, we don't quite know, and it's interesting then that lived experience possibly written into this theological code, like we're not going to do it to the point that we say God doesn't want you to do it. It's so fascinating, right?
Well, to the way it's written, you get the distinct impression that the writer is assuming that the reader is not going to even question this for a moment, that all the reader is looking for is a cookbook. The reader's already accepted that there's going to be these bad animals and good animals. Now, just tell me which ones they're going to be. I love that says, no, I'm eating pork, nope, I wouldn't even think about this. I'm not on the same page with you, and clearly, it supports your understanding that this was originally a verbal and oral tradition. Because clearly, we're past the point where this isn't even an argument anymore, now we're just recording what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's where we don't know, because like this could have come out of hundreds of years of practice, and it may have come from practices that weren't from the Israelite nation. This could have been a lot of the ancient world. They just didn't do these things. And this is, again, it's like we're going to give reason to taboo now. We're going to give reason for what we're doing, whether or not it's actually the reason what we're doing.
Could you talk about why they set aside the Day of Atonement?
Can you say more about that, please?
Yeah. Why do we have it? Why do Jews have a Day of Atonement? And they still have Yom Kippur today, the highest holy day of the year, right?
So the question is why do they still have Yom Kippur? Why do we have it in the first place? So in Leviticus, the reasons given for doing this once a year is first off, God says, but more importantly, we need to keep the nation of Israel clean. If the nation of Israel is not clean enough, is not holy enough, God's not going to stay. That's that fear that if we're not a good enough nation for God, especially the priestly source, their fear is we're going to be taken over again. So we just lived through that. We got kicked out of the land, now we're back. The reason that I believe Jews would still do it is they still need that atonement. Even if it's not necessarily for the nation of Israel, I think it's now probably seen more a little bit in the individual context because it's so differently lived now that there isn't a temple in Jerusalem, and that I think Jews are just spread so much more throughout the world than they would have been at this time. But still, it's how do you get atonement? And we look at Hebrews, that's our answer to why we as Christians don't have this day anymore. Christ did it for us. It's been done. But at the same time, I would argue for us as Christians, we need to find our own ways to find atonement. Because atonement means to be at one with. And we can certainly get out of sync with God. We can certainly go astray. So somehow, I hope that we, at those times, find our way back. And how do we do that? And it's not nearly as formalized or as extravagant, I would say, as the Day of Atonement. But I hope that we do something.
Well, the other thing is, in Hebrews, that Jesus is the new high priest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We don't even go directly to God the Father, so that changes the whole system.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We don't have to go through the earthly priest, and we don't have to make all these sacrifices, that Jesus has done it all, and we have a direct relationship with God. That changes the whole thing.
Yeah, Catherine raised a great point that we don't need to go through all these other avenues now. That we can go directly to God in this new way that Christ opened up the doors for us, and that we can just go straight to God. Thank you.
You think Christians have a Day of Atonement basically when we have Holy Communion? Because it's from one perspective, in Lutheranism, it's you're given forgiveness of sins when you go to Holy Communion.
So I can't speak as much to the Lutheran perspective. Sorry, I'll say the question. So the question is do we have a Day of Atonement when we take communion? I'm going to talk about the Presbyterian perspective, which is that we have the grace of God. Like, it's not like it's exchanging one for the other. That, yes, because I took communion from you, I now get forgiveness. What's the line, Liz, you might be able to help me out with this, that communion at the same time, is the grace of God, and tells us the grace of God, and is experiencing the grace of God. It's something like that. That's all of it's the grace of God. So, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's Day of Atonement, but one of the things that one of our confessions I love talks about the understanding of communion is, should you take communion if you're doubting or you're unsure? And one of the confessions from the Reformation era says, yes, you should take communion. If you are doubting or unsure, communion is the way you strengthen yourself and find your way back to God. So you better go first, almost, is what it's saying. I don't want to say that communion communicates the forgiveness, but I think it can bring you back into that experience and really help you re-experience the grace of God.
To me, I was raised Catholic. Atonement was the sacrament of confession, and that was atonement.
And so Bob was just saying that for him, growing up as Catholic, that the sacrament of confession is atonement. And what I'd love to point out about that is, that is scriptural. It's in James where it says how good it is to confess your sins. Obviously, as Presbyterians, we don't call that a sacrament. But one thing I always like to challenge the youth on is, that's a practice we can still do. And it doesn't have to be as formalized as going to a priest who's got the seal of confidentiality. Sometimes in Protestant churches, they'll talk about like prayer partners. People that you can truly have that honesty and vulnerability with about, what's taking you away from God, and lifting that up then in prayer with one another. So we kind of have corollaries. And like I said, I think it can kind of bring you back to that similar idea, that being at one with God again.
Looking at the holiness code, I'm thinking, having grown up in a Christian church, we were taught all this. This is just second nature.
Oh, really?
Oh, sure. I mean, things like, taking care of your neighbor, being ethical, individual responsibility. I mean, all of these things were just bred into you. But apparently back then, they needed to have it written down.
Well, yes. So thank you for raising this point that, some of this, it's kind of common sense if you're living this Christian life, right? And I actually think that's very interesting to me. I was thinking about this as I was getting ready for this. We are different as Christians. We're living in the New Testament covenant. We have a different understanding of ethics because of Christ. And yet, for some reason, we want kids to know the Ten Commandments. So we still are living somewhat out of this Old Testament ethic. And they aren't supposed to necessarily contradict each other as much as it's this new understanding. And bear in mind, so the reason they're writing it down now is they're coming out of crisis. They are saying maybe the reason that Babylonians and Assyrians took us over is we weren't doing this. And the other thing we always question about Leviticus is, was it the ideal or was it what was happening? Perhaps it was the ideal. Perhaps this is what we wanted to see happening, but didn't do it.
Weren't they worshiping false idols?
Yeah, I mean, if you just read the Old Testament, don't you just sometimes want to shake Israel? I mean, it's this repetitive story of they go to God, they're in a good place, and they do something and something happens. But again, I want to challenge that. Is that our story too?
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, it's completely our story.
Yeah.
It's just that we're doing it differently. So it seems so comical to us that they're trying all these different gods, but that's secularism. I mean, that's just us saying the goal of my life is to, get a good job and make a lot of money. It's the same thing. We're still looking for our fulfillment in all the wrong places. And that's what they were doing too. It's just, it was more obvious since they were doing it by just worshiping a different God. Why aren't people at church on Sunday mornings? Because they put these false gods in front of them that they'd rather go shopping, play golf or, or whatever it's gonna be. It's really the same thing. It's still continuing to look for your purpose and where you're putting your energy externally rather than in God. And there's gotta be a balance, of course. But we're still out of, we're out of balance, just the way they were out of balance.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, Liz. And so one thing that's interesting is right now, considering our political situations that are going on, you read this verse from 1934 about taking care of the alien in your nation. It's so interesting because we're still grappling with that because you have people on various sides of what do we do with these crises that we're having in America, and you have different opinions. So some of this is trying to figure it out, right? What does that look like? Here's the decree to do it, but what does doing it mean?
I was wondering what they considered neighbor, because they came up and asked Jesus, who is that neighbor? And then Jesus, I think, went to an extreme and as far as they were concerned. So I was wondering how they looked at this interpretation then.
Yeah, well, and that I think by then things had considerably changed. But then they're trying to say like, oh well, we'll just change the definition of neighbor a little bit and we'll make it work for us. And then that's when Jesus is changing the ethic, right? He's saying there's something different now. Because
there was other things about that. They weren't supposed to mix with the foreign and so where do you accept the alien or not accept?
Right. Yeah. No. And that's the thing we remember about the Torah that I've read with certain scholars is they're like, we have all these different sources, these different authors, and they're in conversation with each other, but they don't always necessarily agree with each other. And so we're going to take this document that in the Jewish faith is so fundamental and so important and essential, And how do we interpret it? Because it doesn't always agree with itself. So we already that's one question I wanted to raise. We've already kind of heard one answer, but just for you, how similar or dissimilar is this to our Christian understanding? And could an understanding in a framework like this be helpful to us today?
I think at some point we have to be different in a positive way for others to say, why would you do that? Because in their frame of ethics, it's so out of the box that it doesn't make sense to them. And back what Liz was saying, because their goal is to advance my position, and that's not going to advance your position, so it doesn't make sense. And yet they see it as something desirable.
I think it's hard, there's, these cultural issues, and the Bible doesn't always address them in intense specificity. Again, and that's why we can say, I think Christians should be set apart. I think we need to reclaim that we're going to live our lives differently as Christians, but then as Christians we're going to the problem is we're going to disagree on what that means. And we're going to still disagree going to our source, the Bible, and still seeing it, seeing it differently. And that's the challenge, that's the challenge.
It's a very different way to think about how do you push Christianity if you say we're gonna live in such a way that we are different. We are noticeably different. Because that really was a lot of the way these writers were looking at Israel is we need to make it clear that we are the set apart called nation of God. We are holy. And so a lot of these things are kind of possibly the reason why we have some of the rules we do is we're going to point out that we're different. That's why we're going to do it. I'm not convinced that's the wholly best reason to do something, is just because it's different. But if it's different in such a way to honor God, that's actually a very interesting way to look at life.
People, there was criticism about, we all remember the WWJD bracelets, what would Jesus do? But I think in a lot of ways that really, those were really good. Because if we start to go through our day and think, what would Jesus do? It kind of hits you. You still can kind of get a general sense and be like, oh gosh, I don't think Jesus would do that. And I want to, I want to, whatever it is, I want to cut off this person in traffic, or I want to speed, or, I'm like, oh, yeah, Jesus probably wouldn't do that,
Right.
So I think that it's not a bad measuring stick, because we're going to find a lot of times we don't follow that, we don't really want to do that.
One thing when I was preaching here a few weeks ago was kind of talking about that, what do we do, because that's kind of what we do individually.
Right.
But also that I do believe the Spirit calls us to step out into places of vulnerability, which is very scary. But sometimes by stepping out into that vulnerability or just following the call wherever you're being called, you're doing something that will speak to other people why you're doing it.
Well, yesterday I was so amazed because we had a Faith in Action, and the pastor at the Methodist Church on Euclid, for people who think that they're spiritual but they don't go to church. So they play golf or they do something in nature, in God's world. So she is offering, I don't know how she's publicizing this, to take people that feel this way on a kayak trip down the Des Plaines River or someplace. And I thought, well, that's a unique kind of perspective to try to understand them and for them to understand a Christian and why we come to church, why we have a community, what does a community do for us? Because the church, for a long time, I never really thought of how much communal worship and having a faith community enriches, strengthens your own faith. You know, that, I couldn't do it alone. I really couldn't,
They don't know what they're missing.
you know.
I mean, community is so important, and it's all over the Bible. When Jesus sent out the missionaries, he sent them out in pairs for a reason. And again, that's one thing I appreciate about the Old Testament context and culture, is it is very communal. Even if, like I talked about today, like, oh yeah, they're moving towards personal responsibility, that's still not the way you and I think of personality or just individuality. And there's a lot of nations still in the world and cultures still in the world that have a communal sense that we just don't. And that is a loss to us. Well, thank you so much for discussing and sharing and opening up today. So next week is the last week. We're finishing up. We're going to be doing chapters 23 through 27, which is going to be talking about the festivals, calendar, year of Jubilee. So next week's going to be a really good week for parties and social justice. So, because I love that people are so upset about Leviticus or don't like it. I'm like, at the end it just talks about partying. Like, let's just get into that. So, so to close us, I just want to end in prayer again. Holy and gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity we've had to delve into this world you've given us. We ask that you help us live as we are called and live in the way that you want us to. We thank you for the example of Christ that you have sent us, and help us to follow him. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
Actually, I want to say one more thing about community real quick. It's hard, as you said, not only does it help us to be in corporate worship together, but just again, as we think about being set apart, it helps us. One of the things that's hard, I remember someone said to me during Lent, they wanted to give something up. And they were like, you know what, it would be so much, it would just be so much easier if everybody was giving something up. You know what I mean? In earlier times when people lived in smaller communities,